Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. This is Bloomberg Businessweek, insight from the reporters and editors that bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
No question the idea of safety on a lot of minds after the events over the last few days.
Absolutely.
Okay, we heard from law enforcement folks in Las Vegas a little earlier today. They talked about what happened in Las Vegas. We heard earlier in the day, too, about what happened in New Orleans. The event in New Orleans, that one specifically being called terrorism. Mm-hmm. FBI officials say they haven't found evidence linking separate deadly New Year's attacks in New Orleans and Las Vegas. Those are still unfolding, though, the details there. The two incidents, though, Carol, rattling Americans as they rang in New Year's, prompting heightened concerns over U.S. security less than 3 weeks before Donald Trump is set to take over as president.
And then there was the spate of plane crashes late last month. The Azerbaijan Airlines flight that crashed in Kazakhstan on Christmas Day. And then you also had the flight that crashed in South Korea, killing all but 2 on board. There's a lot of things going on that make us question safety, security in today's environment.
It's something Shawn Galloway is always thinking about. He's CEO at ProAct Safety. It's a consulting firm that for more than 30 years has provided strategies for improving safety within different organizations, including organizations such as Boeing. He joins us from Houston, Texas. Shawn, good to have you with us. Give us an idea of how you think about events over the last week, because what I just shared were certainly, they really run the gamut of things that affect a person's safety and individual safety, but they're also rare, but they're top of mind because they're in the news. How do you think about events such as these?
These are, Carol, Tim, thank you for having me on here. These are some of these black swan events that you rarely see coming. However, they're often indicators. And what I've often said is anytime you're surprised by a significant event or a tragedy, either you weren't paying attention to the indicators or you weren't giving them the attention that was necessary. It's unfortunate that events like this have to necessitate a change. If you look, and there's a lot of great people that work for Boeing. I know many of them personally. And if you go back over a decade, 2005, and then several years later, you look at what happened with the BP events, the Texas City explosion in March of 2005, that 15 people lost their lives and over 100 seriously injured. Then we had Deepwater Horizon, the Macondo incident. Both of those moments before, days before, both of those locations, the rig and the plant, BP leadership was there to give them an award for their safety performance. And then both of those tragedies occurred. It's the same situation kind of here, in my opinion, with what's happening with Boeing, is that they're a great organization, a legacy organization, again, in my opinion, with a lot of wonderful people with great intent. They also, from what I've seen, went from an organization that I would refer to having strong signals to an organization that had weak signals. It was an organization run by engineers. Engineering was often on the floor. People could talk about things. And unfortunately, over time, it seemed some of that became suppressed.
Shawn, take a step back for us, because we are intrigued by your relationship or your workings, your company's workings with Boeing in particular. Tell us how long you've been involved with the company. Tell us about kind of maybe the changes that you've seen and your involvement in helping them get through what has felt like crisis after crisis after crisis. Although things seem to be getting better, but it does feel like there's still a lot of questions to be answered.
Yeah, I can't speak to the detailed specifics of the type of work that I do with organizations like Boeing. My work focuses on the pursuit of excellence and safety. So that's both performance and that's culture. So organizations like Boeing will bring people like me in from time to time to make sure they're not breathing their own exhaust, to make sure they're truly seeing things as they are. So they like an objective third-party individual take a look at things. They also bring in people like me to keynote it at some of their events.
What does that mean? What does that mean to keynote it? What does that mean when you come into Boeing and a company that's dealing with some really serious issues? What does it mean to keynote it?
So this was in 2017, so it was prior to prior to the catastrophic events that happened in 2018, 2019 with the plane crashes, keynoting a private event. So company leadership was there together to look at their long-term safety strategy, look at their business strategy. And at the time, I had just authored a book called Forecasting Tomorrow, kind of looking at making predictions over the next 10 years. So they brought me in to serve as a keynote speaker to that. And that's what led to me having the privilege of walking the 737 MAX factory floor in the end of February 2017. So for me, personally, it's always stuck with me. Did I see one of those two planes in the assembly process? Obviously, I'll never know, but it's something that's always resonated with me because most of my work is on the proactive side. That's the name of our company. However, we are brought in from time to time on either side of litigation, but primarily I'm brought in from the company standpoint to make sure events like this, are they one-off or are they systemic?
So before anything goes wrong, right? To say, hey guys, here's what you need to be thinking about.
That's exactly right. And sometimes this is done through attorney privilege documents so we can be fully transparent and tell them, these are the issues. This is because culture is a byproduct. And now the FAA and now all of these third-party investigations are identifying these cultural deficits, some things that aren't where they want them to be as an organization. But every company of substantive size is going to have opportunities to improve culture. But culture is a byproduct. You can't directly manage the byproduct of culture, just like the results of an organization are a byproduct sometimes of collective intentionality or sometimes luck.
Shawn, I do wonder, Boeing went through a lot of changes, corporate culture. We talked about the changing of headquarters and senior management then not being, very far from, their main plant out on the West Coast and so on and so forth. But I am wondering, when you keynoted the address or anything, did you start to see some changes? Did you give the company any kind of heads up, like, wait a minute, you guys might want to rethink some of your strategy here?
I think they had a good plan at the time. I didn't have insight into the potential business disruptors of that plan because the safety strategy can't be a standalone concept or plan for an organization. The safety strategy has to support the overall business trajectory, but it also has to protect against internal and external risks that might affect that plan. So my work was primarily on the safety strategy side of things. The business strategy, and organizations like Boeing, they typically are forecasting several decades out because they're looking at the next platform. They're looking at, what's going to be coming, 20 years from now. I saw a lot of great leaders with wonderful plans to execute on, but I think the erosion of trust and the erosion of communication and speaking up about quality or safety concerns, what seems, in my opinion, to have been unintentionally but suppressed over time, is what led to one of the big contributing factors of kind of what's happening today. That, as you mentioned, distancing senior leadership who are ultimately responsible for any organizational culture, even though they're not really part of the culture because they're too far removed. They're responsible for it. And when I look at the plan that they have today, that's one thing that I would offer some advice on, is that if you look at what they're focusing on, it's primarily around changing employee behavior versus what are the leadership truly being held accountable for.
We only have about 30 seconds left, but I opened talking about the incidents on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day in New Orleans and Las Vegas, respectively. How would you advise large municipalities, just in 30 seconds, to keep people safe during events such as these or during New Year's, stuff like that?
I think it's largely around having a showing of force, but it's also situational awareness. When I served in the military, keeping your head on a swivel, you have to pay attention to what's happening around you at all times. You also have to have contingency plans. And if you look at this recent crash running into a wall, unfortunately, that wasn't part of the contingency thinking. So I think you have to have a proactive side to things, but you also have to have emergency response and a reactive, because things will not go to plan. And if and when things don't, what's the next step? What happens afterwards? So it's not all about prevention. It's also about recovery.
All right, going to leave it on that note. Shawn, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Shawn Galloway, who's CEO of ProAct Safety, joining us from Houston, Texas.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app, or watch us live on YouTube.
Carol, get this.
Yeah.
I did a deep dive into the USDA's economic statistics. I was just thinking about Mike McKee the whole time because I know he knows all this stuff.
All right, and what did that deep dive find?
Food purchased and consumed outside the home. So think restaurants, fast casual, bars, hospitals, schools, delis. Yes, they have this information. It's a category. Accounted for close to 60% of food expenditures in the U.S. in 2023.
That's
food away from
surprising.
home. It's a lot of money, right?
That's a lot, yeah.
Food away from home spending climbed from $1.3 trillion in 2022 to $1.5 trillion in 2023. This is according to the USDA's Economic Research Surface. I didn't know that even existed.
I didn't even know.
It's pretty cool.
Makes sense, though.
Phil Kafarakis watches this number closely. He's the president and CEO over at IFMA, the Food Away from Home Association. It's a trade group for the food service industry. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Phil, how are you?
Doing great, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Hey, good to have you on
Carol.
The program
Hi.
this afternoon. Food away from home. I did sort of deep dive into this because I had never looked closely into this category. But it really is exactly what it sounds like. Anything that you buy outside the house to consume outside the house. So bars, hospitals, pre-made food at delis, everything, right?
Yes, it's a term that's been used by the government to report. And we as an industry just started using it as we transformed our 70-year-old organization from being manufacturer-driven to the food away from home, which includes everything you just mentioned, from food manufacturers to the distribution companies, the restaurants, independent restaurant, chain restaurants, casual dining, hospitals, kiosks, even now delivery is a component of all of this.
That's what I wanted to ask. Yeah, so it includes like Uber Eats, DoorDash. If I call the local Thai food place and they deliver on their own, it includes that as well?
Yeah, delivery. Coming out of the pandemic, everybody was so caught up with how we were going to transform the business. And the resiliency of the restaurant industry just keeps surprising people. But delivery has become an incredible part of what's taken place and facilitated food away from home.
This is a question that when I was talking to Carol about this during prep, this is a question that she had when I told her this number. She said, is this all about prices going up or is it people actually eating more outside the home?
Like transactions,
Yeah,
right?
What's happening here?
Yeah, of course. She has it's both. Traffic has been very stable, I would call it. In some instances, depending on the segment, it's been down. However, because prices have gone up and because of the promotional activity, you are getting more meals, higher check averages, and depending on the segment, you'll get more traffic. I'll give you an example. Great organization in Darden and the way they run their business. They have multiple brands, Olive Garden, and they have all the steakhouses. So when you look at what they do at Olive Garden with the never-ending pasta to get people back into their restaurants at $13.99, that's a pretty good price point. So they're getting traffic. They're getting a higher check average because they're adding $4.99 if you put some shrimp or protein on that meal occasion. So the restaurant industry has been able to do some things to keep traffic up and also drive their check averages. However, there is a downside to all this, and we'll, I'm sure, talk about, pricing and inflation.
Well, I'm the one that drives my husband crazy, and I'm like,
Right.
oh yeah, let's get this, and then I'm like, add this, and add this, and add this, and then like a simple salad all of a sudden is like $40.
No, and then I'm like, I'm not going to get this delivered. I'm going to go pick it up myself and save 25% because the delivery fee,
Yes.
the tip.
We do that all
Yes.
the time, or
Yeah.
increasingly. Not all the time, but increasingly if we can. All right, so what's the downside?
Well, the other side of this is we got the inflation monsters roaring at the beginning of the year. Commodity prices are soaring. I mean, just when you think about coffee and chocolate alone and cacao and coffee beans, but, protein, if you go try to get a steak, an 8-ounce, filet somewhere, depending on back to Darden, if you go to Ruth Chris, you're going to pay 8 ounces. You're probably going to get it for close to like $50-$60. If you're going to go to Longhorn, you can get a Texas T-bone for $21-$22. So depending, again, on what you're looking for and what you're going to get, the concepts and the restaurateurs have been able to price accordingly. The problem, though, is we've got costs in the supply chain. We've got not only commodity costs, but we also have organizational issues with not only the labor coming back, but labor is an issue when you think about just in fast food in California, starting at, for one this year, $20 minimum. For being behind the counter at a McDonald's or a Burger King. Not only is it just availability of talent, but it also costs some money to be able to get the right people in the restaurant and make sure that the service is where you want it to be and they're trained and you don't have any problems.
Hey, I want to jump in real quick. $20 minimum wage for fast food workers in California. With the hindsight of a few months after that has been implemented, how has that worked out in your view?
And how does the industry, your members, are they happy about it?
Yeah, no one's happy about it. And
maybe the people who are working are happy.
Right. The people that are working are happy about it. It's not about that. I mean, we want to make sure workers are getting paid fairly. And, there's a balance here so that employment doesn't go down and people don't close restaurants, because some have, because of the labor problem. But you've got a situation in California where there's a panel of industry experts, apparently, that are going to determine what the rates are going to be. And it's a little bit awkward. Everybody's been trying to find a way to manage it properly to keep the staff, feeling good about what's going on. But at the same time, is a regulatory issue that is going to cause havoc and confusion as it goes across the states, because there's also a tax credit, a tip credit problem coming down the road. So when you start to factor that out, and then you see what's happened with organized labor, people are paying attention to restaurant staff and servers and back of the house and everybody you need to be, part of a happy-go-lucky team that provides a great experience.
Listen, we know, certainly coming off the pandemic, what a tough industry it is, the restaurant industry overall. Even some of the really established names, the well-known chefs and their organizations. I mean, it was not an easy environment, to say the least. Having said that, I mean, what is top of mind for the members of your organization as they look at 2025? Is it food costs? Is it labor costs? Is it the administration? Is it regulatory oversight? Is it concerns about the economy, the U.S. economy, and consumers pulling back? What is it?
Oh my God, Carol, you named it all. I mean, part of what we talk about here is VUCA, the VUCA environment, when things are, there's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity coming together. Well, that was happening when we came out of COVID. But now you've got, attention deficit disorder meets VUCA. Right now, you have to be focused on what's going on in your restaurant, meaning that you got to be careful with what's happening with your costs. Your menu costs. You got to be careful with what you've got on your menu. You got to have happy people in your restaurant, creating a service environment that people love. You got to be on top of your promotional activity to balance that out. You've got to be a good partner with your supply chain and the distribution community that's serving you and the manufacturers that are trying to get you product. You cannot be caught up in all this anticipatory, distractions around tariffs and the immigration policy and some of these things that have been chatted about. Everybody's a little bit worried about what might happen. But, right now, I think everybody's focused really beyond the regulatory environment. And we have things in regulatory that are taking place already that we've got to worry about. But it's those factors that, again, make up your P&L and make sure that the industry is not going to get caught up in some whipsaw because somebody's expecting that there might be tariffs or there might not be tariffs. There are things for us, particularly regulatory right now, that are taking place that are important to focus on. That will cost restaurateurs and the supply chain and our members money.
Hey, one of the things Tim and I spend a lot of time talking about is the global food supply chain and the impact climate change has had on all of it. I am curious, too, that what you are hearing from members on that front, how it is getting more difficult in terms of accessing the necessary food supplies that they need, and then how that potentially plays into inflationary pressures sticking around longer.
Yeah, that's. Thank you for asking that question. One of the things that's going on right now, you're hearing a lot about it, and I've heard some of your experts talk about cocoa and coffee. I mean, the weather effects across the world are the adverse weather conditions that are taking place, particularly in the South. In South America right now, the things that are happening, the drought in Brazil, the situation out in the Ivory Coast. Again, not only crazy weather patterns, but also disease in the crop. When you're starting to look at those type of effects in the supply chain with raw materials that we import, that does drive prices to all-time highs, especially when you think about cocoa. And it also causes problems because you can't recover very quickly. In some of these instances, there's a thing called swollen swollen shoot disease that goes into the vines, and to replant cocoa might take 5 years. So there's an effect with that. And then, of course, the effect being halfway around the world is the supply chain, the cost of moving product, from one end of it to the other. And that continues to be a point of concern when you're thinking about long term and you're thinking about short term, particularly when you're trying to get a cup of coffee for less than $5.
We only have 30 seconds left. Bird flu. How concerned are your members about bird flu?
Yes, it's come up. Everybody's a little freaked out about it because we did have it before the holidays. Folks are managing it. It's very localized, and at this point in time, it hasn't created any major issues right now in the supply chain. But we are watching it.
Okay, Phil, we're going to have to leave it there. Hopefully that's the extent of what happens when it comes to bird flu. Phil Kafarakis, he is president and CEO over at IFMA-The Food Away from Home Association, a trade group for the food services industry.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Okay, we know about the greatest generation.
Check.
The silent generation.
Check.
Do you know there's a generation before the greatest generation?
What is it?
They are called...
Are you serious?
Yeah, the lost generation.
Oh, I do know that.
Yeah.
I do know that. Okay.
And then I guess we forget about everyone before that. But
right. And then there's...
That's neither here nor there.
Sorry, everybody. And then there's the massive boomers.
Boomers.
Gen X. Millennials.
Yep.
Gen Z.
Yep.
Then where else?
Then it gets a little complicated.
Yeah.
Gen Alpha. That's 2013 to mid-2020s.
Okay.
Those are my kids, I guess.
Okay.
And then now that we're in the mid-2020s, it's time for the next generation.
Dun, dun, dun.
We're talking Generation Beta.
Okay.
And they're born from 2025 to 2039. So most of them aren't even alive yet.
All right. So we're waiting. But
we're waiting.
Projecting what
there are a few of them.
What they're going to be like.
Happy birthday to them. Despite that, PGIM set out to figure out what this generation would look like. They interviewed doctors, scientists, parents, and more. 2,000 Americans to get predictions for the future of Generation Beta.
David Blanchett is Managing Director, Portfolio Manager, and Head of Retirement Research at PGIM. He joins us from Lexington, Kentucky. David, Happy New Year. Great to have you here with Tim and myself. So tell us about this project, because we really haven't talked about this next generation, Generation Beta. So tell us what you set out to do.
Well, first, you all kind of introduced this idea of generations. And you mentioned baby boomers. They were actually the first generation to kind of have a name. It was essentially like a group of individuals at a certain age. And so we've kind of moved forward through time. You mentioned the boomers, Gen X, millennials, the alphas. Now we have the betas. So everyone born on January 1st, 2025, for the next 15 years is going to be part of Generation Alpha. And obviously, there's still a lot of those babies to come. But, we were curious, what might the future hold? What are we looking at in terms of this newest generation? So as you all mentioned, a pretty exhaustive survey, reviewing kind of expert opinions, surveying 2,000 Americans, and lots of interesting perspectives people have about, things like life in general, retirement, longevity, just lots of interesting projections about the future.
I mean, don't you think if you went back in time, I'm just trying to figure out a corollary here that makes sense, but if you went back in time, to the 1970s and said to folks, what do you think people born, in the 1980s to the 2000s would experience in life? They're not going to be talking about smartphones and, AI. They're going to be talking about flying cars because that's what we thought would happen.
Right, exactly.
There's this disconnect between predictions and what actually happens, right?
Well, and so I think that's why, I think this is informative, it's useful, but it's really difficult to think about what's going to happen in the future, right? So, for example, one of the questions in the survey was what would you call this generation? And you just said it a second ago, but the most common nickname was Generation AI. Even 3 or 4 years ago, that probably isn't the name that we'd use to describe this latest cohort. So I do think there is a lot of things that are changing, but to me, this idea of change was probably the biggest theme in the survey, where there's just lots of expectations where, kind of every facet of raising children, of saving for retirement, of planning for healthcare, people will change in the future, especially for this Generation Beta.
What about in terms of, I'm really curious about how we work, right? Here we are, 4 years off the pandemic. We thought it was going to be transformational. And I guess for some who are still working from home, it is, but there's a lot more people who are being pressured to come back to the office. How do you think about this generation, or what did you hear about how they think they will be working?
Sure. So 83% of respondents thought that retirement will look completely different for Generation Beta. And well, why is that? It's because there's this idea of mini retirement, and this idea that as we kind of evolve through the workforce, we're going to be changing jobs. So other stats would be that 74% of people thought that Generation Beta would work less than 5 days a week. 80% of respondents thought that people would have 3 distinct career paths over time. So I think that there is this kind of emerging perspective that this idea of having kind of one job and one profession for 30 or 40 years isn't the future of work based upon how things are changing.
David, is that because we're going to be living to 150? So yeah, we're going to have these mini retirements. We're going to have these mini, transformations in our careers.
So I think that people will be living longer. I focus on retirement research, and I don't think we're going to have most people living to 150, but we are going to see improvements in longevity, right? And those improvements kind of radically create complexity around on how we plan for retirement. And so to me, it isn't all that surprising that there's this perspective that Generation Beta isn't going to retire. Right, to the extent that we can create jobs and create abilities to work longer. Lots of folks that want to retire. Actually, personally, I don't love the word retirement. I like the word financial independence. What people want to be able to do is to save money and eventually stop working. And I think that's where we're seeing this perspective around Generation Beta, where they're going to be this, in theory, this group of individuals that doesn't have the same retirement as everyone else. That being said, a stat that blows my mind is that they're not going to be age 70 until the year 2095. So retirement in 70 years is going to be very different than it is today.
Oh, to be young, born in 2039, sure would be nice.
Already, right?
Already, I'm thinking about it. One thing that I was surprised, and you're reminding me about this, is in a history class in college, I remember studying, I believe it was in like the 1920s maybe, the rise of leisure and the fact that people they weren't stuck in the fields 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for the first time ever. So there certain things started happening, and I could be getting the dates wrong, and I know I'm overgeneralizing here, but I think if they were to look at our lives now, they'd say, oh, wow, those people never work. But when are we going to have like a 4-day work week or a 3-day work week? Because automation is going to be doing such a good job.
Are you asking for them or for you?
I'm asking for me. Okay. When are the markets going to only be open 4 days a week, and then we only have to work 4 days a week? That's what I want to know.
So, 74% of respondents in the survey thought that Generation Beta would work less than 5 days a week. And so I think that, again, there is this idea of work becoming more fluid versus this kind of structured 9 to 5 thing. Now, obviously, we saw during COVID, a rise of remote work, people not even be in the office to do their jobs, and a lot of companies kind of pull people back into the office. I think that there is this emerging perspective that this requirement to be, at a desk in an office 5 days a week, it's not gone, but it's kind of slowly evolving into something else that is a lot more flexible.
One thing I want to talk about is healthcare. We talked about longevity, and I feel like there's a bunch of things here in terms of your findings. Half of adults believing that cancer will be cured by Gen Beta. 71% predicting that Gen Beta will have individualized healthcare based on their DNA. And I feel like we continually or increasingly, Tim, are having conversations about individualized medicine. Talk to us a little bit more about that, because it's an incredible cost to society. It's an incredible cost to individuals that we still haven't figured out some of these major ailments. So pull that together for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of an optimistic perspective. I too saw the 51% stat of thinking that Generation Beta would cure cancer. I think that to me, what resonates looking across the responses is just this idea again of kind of like the evolving state of healthcare. I think the idea of personalized medicine. There's some questions about like AI, things like that. I think the way that individuals can receive treatment is going to change. And I think that was a key theme among the respondents in the survey. So healthcare, I think that people think is going to evolve in the future and radically affect Generation Beta in terms of how they enjoy their lives and also when they eventually retire.
Okay. Better get to work. I was kind of hoping cancer would be cured before then.
fingers crossed. I would love to see that. Yeah. The other thing is just one more stat on all of this. 59% think AI, artificial intelligence, will be able to predict and prevent health issues before symptoms appear. And it's just, as you know, we have spent, you're in the investment world, the last 2 years talking about nothing but AI, generative AI, large language models, and so on, and the impact. Although I think people are thinking it's going to take a while for all of this to pay off and be put to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions was like 60% of respondents think that AI is going to raise their kids, and so I think that there's a lot of positive expectations in here around artificial intelligence and how its role in terms of education, in terms of the role of kind of helping individuals have better personalized experiences based upon their unique preferences.
I'm wondering about technology and the folks you interviewed. How did their answers vary based on who you talked to? Because you talked to doctors, you talked to parents, you talked to technologists, you talked to scientists. How did they think differently about different generations?
Well, it's funny. One of the differences that I noticed with the responses was the older generations, like boomers, weren't as optimistic about the possibilities, the future of the generation beta. Beyond that, if you look at just maybe at a higher level, if you look at things like regrets and the things that people would change based upon their lifestyles, you have things like saving for retirement and spending time with kids, things like that. Those were very different for older Americans versus younger Americans. So a lot of the questions, I didn't see big differences in terms of, looking at boomers, millennials, Gen X, but you do see it in terms of things people say, well, what do I wish I had done differently looking back on my life?
Yeah, I mean, it happens all the time, right? Whatever generation it's called, right? I think
there's a lot of social media posts that go viral about that now.
Yeah.
People who interview people at the end of their lives about what they regret, what they want to do more of.
And it's never.
it's never. Let me just say, it's never tweeting more. That's what I'll tell you. They never say, "I wish I would have spent more time tweeting."
That was a safe play.
Yeah,
that was a safe play. Hey, having said that, I was kind of drawn to statistics that you shared with our producer and our team. The people surveyed estimate that Generation Beta will need approximately $1.88 million to sustain in retirement. That seems like a low number.
I think it's all relative. It's a big number. But like I said, I mean, we're talking about people retiring, 70, 65 years from now. I think there are some really important things here. There was one, I think, useful stat that 80%, think that Generation Beta should, in a perfect world, start saving for retirement as soon as the child's born. And that's probably not realistic. I think most, I have 4 alphas myself, no betas. And that's tough.
Yeah, no betas yet.
No betas yet. I think I'm no plan betas on our half. But I think that there is this notion.
David, your wife is calling.
Retirement's tough, right? And so I think that one thing that will make retirement tough, as we talked about earlier, is this increasing longevity. But I also don't love that word, like I said, retirement. I think that it's going to be more possible for us to do things that are economically additive at later ages, right? And I mean, along those lines, one of the important stats in the report was that the number one regret of all respondents was that they didn't save enough for retirement. Okay. Well, what's really interesting is that is never the highest regret of any of the generations. So not saving for retirement is this kind of regret that kind of echoes across generations, but it's never the biggest thing. If you look at like boomers, for example, they wanted to, spend more time with their loved ones and take care of their health, things like that. So I think that, we, there is that big number, that 1.88 million, but I think what's important is things like not saving for retirement, was actually a bigger focus among younger respondents, but they were worried about everything. They just have regrets galore. As individuals get older, those regrets fade away. But to your question and point, retirement is very expensive. And if we start living to age 110, 120, it's even more expensive than today.
But is it also something that's more top of mind maybe for younger generation? Because it's not like when my dad retired and there was pension and VA benefits and Social Security and investments. I mean, there was all these different pools, and it's a very different environment for a lot of workers nowadays.
What is? I mean, so we've got, I think, like personally, I don't love the fact that the trust fund for Social Security is projected to go bankrupt in about 10 years. It creates a lot of uncertainty around like the bedrock of our retirement being there, but also like we've entered a world of personal responsibility for retirement savings. You've got to save in your 401k, in your IRA, things like that, and I think that that's a really good way to help individuals accumulate money for retirement. But you need to make sure they have access to a plan. But kind of a bigger problem to some extent is, okay, you get to retirement and you have, I don't know, $500,000, $1 million. It's like, now what? Like you train these people to save for 30 or 40 years, and all of a sudden you've got to figure out how you're going to spend down that money, and you don't know how long you're going to live, what the markets are going to do, and it's Social Security bankrupt. And so I think that we have a pretty good system, but it places a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of the average American. Mm-hmm. And that's where, having help, having an advisor, using certain tools or resources, I think that's really becoming more valuable, because you only have one shot at retirement. You can't screw it up. And so getting help to figure out what the best thing to do is just becoming, I think, more important for all Americans.
Hey, are you concerned at all about a lack of Generation Beta actually appearing, because childcare has gotten so expensive, and it's so expensive to have kids? I know I don't need to tell you how much you have to save for college, considering you have 4 of them, but it's just gotten so expensive. And I know my generation, fewer and fewer people are having kids. Is that a concern?
It is. And so it was really interesting is one of the questions they asked was, among those who aren't going to be having children, like, why is that? And so my wife is a veterinarian, and one of the top reasons was people are viewing their pets as a child. And if you follow this trend in other countries, you see this in other places where individuals are kind of substituting having kids for having pets. And the number one cited reason often is just the costs and the time it takes to actually raise children.
All right, so we've just got a couple minutes left here, and I am curious, with all that is said and done, all that we've talked about, what is kind of top of mind for you guys? PGIM, you guys invest. Like, I don't know, what are you thinking about this next generation, this beta generation?
So, to be perfectly honest, like, I'm not incredibly worried about 1 year-old saving for retirement, right? I think that it's going to be an issue. I think what we're probably more focused on is individuals who are investing for today. So I spend a ton of time thinking about, like, how do we create solutions for individuals who are around retirement? And to me, it does get to this earlier point just about where, everyone's retirement is their own. Right. And for better or for worse, we all have to worry about the markets misbehaving, about living a long time. And it's just really, really complicated. And so I think, at a high level, the job of all of us needs to be, when we're young, to make good financial choices, to save in our 401k and invest well. But the decisions you've got to make when you get closer to retirement just are really, really complex. And, I'd like to think that things are going to get easier for Generation Beta, but it's probably the opposite. And so hopefully, we can learn from a lot of the mistakes, for better or for worse, that individuals make today, so that future generations, as they retire, have things a bit easier.
I did a college calculator while I was away on break.
And? Oh, for what it's going to cost you for your kids?
It's not pretty.
What's the number you came up with?
More than $600,000 for a private, if you want to go to private school.
For one or for both?
For one.
For one. Good luck, honey. All right, David, we got to leave it there. Hey, listen, thanks so much. This was fun, interesting, and enlightening. David Blanchett, Managing Director, Portfolio Manager, and Head of Retirement Research at PGIM, joining us from Lexington, Kentucky. No, like, that's one of the things we talk about all the time, right? The cost of college.
Yeah, it's
it just keeps going up and up and up. Intimidating.
We'll see if it can keep going up and up and up. I know 20 years ago you were probably saying that.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I don't know that I ever thought it, but we've talked so many times, like over the years, about how it's been outpacing inflation, and it just continues to do so.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.